this, I don't know whether it would be the last Freeman seminar for the year, but maybe the penultimate one. We always leave room for issues as they arise. This is one we've been looking forward to for some time, because it's going to be an exploration of a very new area. And we have two distinguished members of the Carlson School of faculty with us today, both from strategic management and entrepreneurship. They're going to be talking about a corner of corporate social responsibility, or to put it another way, they're going to be talking about thinking that comes out of that part of what goes on at business schools dealing with corporate responsibility. And it's very, very fascinating work. Aseem Kaul has spoken to this group before. Some years ago, he talked about outsourcing. That, as an economist, appealed very much to me. It was an ingenious and fascinating talk, but a little more usual for somebody from a business school faculty. Aseem has done a lot. He's been a business consultant for McKinsey well, I won't say many years ago, but actually it has been a number of years ago now. His research focuses on the relationship between firm scope and capabilities, examining how new capabilities and technologies are best governed and organized, and the organizational boundary choices firms make with respect to their subsequent innovation. More recently, and this is very relevant for his presentation today, he's been exploring the social and political strategies that firms adopt to influence their business environment, focusing specifically on the consequences of such strategies for social welfare. I met his colleague, Jiao Luo, just last week, terrifically interesting person. She has her degree from Columbia Business School, and her research is on the intersection of organization theory and non-market strategy. The way she describes it is that she builds on the notion that non-market activity may benefit the firm's performance, and she talks about how firms address questions of why firms engage in these activities, under which conditions might non-market activities benefit shareholders, and what may be the impact of firms' non-market actions on society, separate from the impact on firms. And I think that's really the twist that's coming up today, is that if you're at the B school, at the end of the day, the bottom line is the bottom line, either directly or indirectly. Whereas this literature that they're working on the development of is something much closer to what we're interested in at the Humphrey School, which is how do different organizational forms serve social purposes most effectively. Now, this is new in the CSR field. I remember several years ago, I was telling our guests at lunch the other day, I remember seeing something like by Michael Porter, who was I was in graduate school with, who's a big business strategy guy, talking about how CSR would be best accomplished by firms, and his idea was, well, instead of giving away money, you have firms make contributions geared to their own special expertise. It sounds obvious, but it's a movement in this direction. But the direction they're moving in today, our guests, is much more ambitious than that. And they call it From Social Responsibility to Social Impact, a Framework and Research Agenda. I think Aseem's going to go first. So welcome to both of them.
Thanks so much, Bob. It's always it's great to be back here. As Bob said, I gave a seminar here, I want to say 6-7 years ago, before I'd been converted to thinking about social impact. I'm not entirely happy about being the last Freeman seminar. I kind of feel like I'm causing that, but anyway, hopefully that's not true. You know, when Bob generously invited us to give this talk, we faced a little bit of Jiao and I faced a little bit of a Sophie's Choice problem, because he said, well, you can present your joint work, and we said, well, that's now 6 papers and counting. So which one should we pick? And we decided we would not pick one, we would just talk about all of them. So I'm going to talk really, really fast for the next 5 minutes. But what we wanted to do was really share not so much one particular paper, but as Bob was alluding to, a stream of work and a kind of large project that we've been working on that has produced a number of papers and really highlighting the things that connect them together and a framework that we see emerging out of that work. So we're going to tell you the story as though we start with the framework and then tell you the papers, but it's actually the other way around. We came up with the papers and then now we're sort of synthesizing the overarching framework. And that framework is new and we're kind of, so we'd love to get, in the discussion portion, we'd love to get your thoughts on it as well. Before I go to the framework, I just want to provide a little bit of background on, so as Bob said, we come from the business school and a tradition of research and corporate social responsibility within management. And so just to make sure that we're all on the same page, we want to spend maybe a couple of minutes just talking about that tradition. At the risk of widely oversimplifying, I would say most research in the CSR tradition is implicitly or explicitly a reaction to a claim made in an op-ed piece by Milton Friedman back in 1970, half a century ago. We still kind of live in his shadow. Saying, the social responsibility of business is to make money, right? So in Friedman's view, managers should make money, they should reward, they should maximize gains for their shareholders, and as long as all managers do that, the market with very tiny amounts of help from the government will take care of everything else, and then everybody will live happily ever after. And corporate social responsibility research, at least in management, has generally not been on Friedman's side. So, originally I think there was a large movement for about 15, 20 years, the so-called stakeholder perspective or stakeholder view, which said, no, managers actually need to be responsible to more than their shareholders. They need to be responsible to all of the various consequences that the firm's actions touches upon, the stakeholders of the firm, to include customers, employees, the larger community, etc. But very kind of quick, over the last 20, 25 years, I think the emphasis has shifted a lot more to saying, well, we don't need to frame this as a conflict. We don't need to think about it as shareholders versus stakeholders. We can think about the sort of win-win opportunities. So we can think about, and I would put Michael Porter's work very much in that spirit. We're going to create value and we're going to share value with everyone. So we're going to share value with stakeholders and we're going to share value with shareholders. Essentially, in a nutshell, firms can do well by doing good. So the path to higher profits is by being good to your employees, by being good to your customers, by being good to the community, right? At least long-run profits are maximized if we do that. That idea has spurred a cottage industry of empirical work in the management and strategy literature. Much of it originally focusing on the idea that essentially providing evidence of a positive relationship between corporate social responsibility, sometimes measured as corporate philanthropy, sometimes measured as various other types of indices of sustainability, responsibility, what have you. But however measured, a positive relationship between CSR and firm financial performance, right? So firms that are seen as more responsible have higher profitability, higher financial returns, etc. I think the early work really looked at it as an association. Later work has really started to prove a causal relationship, more carefully thinking about, can we actually show that one leads to the other? And then, increasingly there's been work that starts to break that overall effect down into where does it come from. So we have work showing that consumers tend to respond firms that they see as tend to reward firms that they see as socially responsible by paying higher prices, by being more loyal to the brand. Employees tend to reward them by accepting lower wages, by shirking less. So Jiao has a paper, a separate paper that looks at kind of employee shirking and the effects of CSR. They work harder, they are less likely to leave the company. Regulators tend to view firms more positively. Community activists don't attack them as much, right? So a variety of different stakeholders rewarding firms that they see as socially responsible. Our starting point though with all of that is to say, well, okay, that's great, But again, right, that, I mean, obviously, as Bob said, we're in the business school, so we're thinking about financial performance. We've shown that firms that are seen to do good do well. That doesn't really tell us that the firms are doing good, right? Just because you give a bunch of money to a foundation, or just because you do something that counts on some, you know, index put together, the KID index or whatever, it's not clear that that's actually adding to social welfare, right? And theoretically, part of Friedman's original critique was, why would we think that corporate managers have either the judgment or the authority to solve social problems? And this entire literature doesn't really provide much of an answer to that question. We're not really providing a strong, plausible rationale for why corporate managers who've been trained in business schools to make money for their firms are suddenly experts at solving poverty or health issues or whatever. And empirically, when you start to look at the work, at least in strategy that's looked at CSR, almost none of it actually looks at what are the social outcomes of these actions, right? So there's a 2020 review piece that just came out, which runs through every single paper in strategy or management that has the word social impact in it, and looks at whether they do a credible job of empirically measuring social impact. And their conclusion is there isn't a single study that rigorously measures social impact except one, and I will talk more about that because it happens to be one of our studies, but we really love this review piece. And that study actually finds the opposite. It finds that, you know, firms that do more philanthropy are actually doing more harm to society. So really not a whole lot of evidence. And so, you know, the two questions that we kind of started off trying to answer when we got started in this project was, look, okay, so firms are making money by doing this, but are they actually making a concrete difference in curing the social ills that they claim to be curing? And if, assuming we wanted that to happen, and we do want that to happen, we do want corporate social responsibility to be a force for good, what would that look like? What would that involve? How would we go about doing that? And so, as I said, we have this kind of emergent framework that's coming out of some of the work we've been doing. So that's the framework we're going to focus on for today's talk. I'm going to start by just describing the framework overall, and then we'll dive into each criteria. But the basic idea here is that any action, any CSR activity that has to meet 4 criteria in order to be able to unambiguously claim that it's adding to social welfare, where social welfare is defined as Pareto improvement, right? So you make some people better off without making anyone else worse off. And the purpose of this is really to highlight, is to really do 2 things. One is to highlight the fact that there is a substantial gap between claiming you're doing something socially responsible or giving a bunch of money to philanthropy and actually creating Pareto improvement from a welfare perspective. And we want to document all the different sort of reasons why, all the different kind of holes that you could fall into along the way that might constitute that gap. At the same time, even though we're going to, you know, it's going to be, I warn you, I should have said this earlier, this is going to be somewhat depressing because I think most of it ends up saying, yeah, this is all not actually helping society. But our goal is not to say we should stop CSR entirely. Our goal is to say, look, wouldn't it be great if instead of just calling anything and everything CSR, we could separate the wheat from the chaff and say, here are the initiatives here is what a well-designed initiative would look like. Here, if an initiative that actually meets these 4 criteria, and at the end we'll talk about some examples of things that we think might, and they're by no means the only examples. Well-designed initiatives can actually make a positive impact on society. But in order to get there, we need to think carefully about all this potential slippage along the way, and not just assume uncritically that everything that calls itself CSR, that all that glitters is gold, basically. And so, as I said, and as you can see at the bottom of that slide, you know, I mentioned we have about 6 or 7 papers. So we're going to use those papers to just illustrate some of the points that we're trying to make around where the slippage exists. That's not to say that's the only work that's been done. There are certainly other people in each of those buckets. It's just easier for us to talk about our papers than to talk about other people's papers. I'm going to hand it over to Jiao, who's going to talk about the substantiveness criteria, and then we'll kind of just go back and forth on each of these. Yeah?
Okay. Thanks, Aseem, and thanks, Bob, for having us. In case you're wondering what's the division of labor here, Aseem is in charge of talking really fast. I'll go a little slower. So first of all, substantiveness. So essentially, the first column, what we're wondering, what we're trying to think about is, are these CSR initiatives actually generating substantive impact to the intended stakeholders, right? So what are the, it's possible that some of those are just symbolic versus actual efforts. It's also possible that those are not necessarily well thought out, some of it which may be ill-conceived, right? So we need to kind of be able to distinguish the substantive type of CSR activities versus the ones that doesn't produce actual impact. So how do we do that? In this Okay, so what we did, the empirical approach we took is to say, okay, why don't we, to answer that question, we need to not only think about whether firms do something, but also how do they do it, right? And one dimension of the how is, are they kind of doing, given the same amount of resources, are they focusing on one or two initiatives? Or are they, which is the specialization aspects, or are they just spreading the wealth around, which is they do a lot of various different things, which is the variety. Now the argument for specialization would be knowledge, would be expertise, would be saving the nonprofits a lot of time for fundraising, all of those things, which may translate into more effectiveness for CSR, as well as better recognition from the stakeholders. Now the argument for variety is, well, you have multiple stakeholders who all want very different things. There's good reasons, financial performance-wise, for firms to actually spread the resources around in order to appeal to multiple different interests. So what we did was, in translating that intuition into empirical work, what we did was to collect data on corporate foundation donation, right? And the nice thing about it is we have fairly complete records from foundation 1990s in terms of which causes are firms giving to, what amount, as well as geographical location, which is not going to be that useful in this paper, but in another paper we also will share later on. And if you look at distribution of the number of different causes firms are the corporate donation money are going into, it's all over the place, right? There's some that's doing just one or two cause areas, and cause areas are defined by the nonprofits taxonomy, right? So there's firms that are doing one or two, and there are firms that's doing all 26 of things. In practice, it's not quite clear that there is a convergent pattern. So what we want to highlight is this idea of information asymmetry, right, in corporate donation. Essentially, the way corporate donation are structured is such that you actually have supporters who are on the top, the one with bleeding heart, right? They may be consumers, they may be employees, they may be investors. They care about something, and they care, potentially about health issues, environment, penguins, children, all of the potential recipients. And corporate donation, essentially what it is you are compensating the for-profit firms by either giving them higher price on their products, or by being willing to work for the firms but receiving less pay, right? So essentially you're channeling some of those resources in the hope that the firms would help the eventual recipients. Now that creates this information asymmetry problem, which is that the supporters are not the recipients. So they may not have knowledge or information about what the final recipients would want, right? Even if if there's well intention, there is still, first of all, we need to question if they're well intentioned. Second, there's still a knowledge gap in terms of what's best for the recipients versus, whether the supporters know about it. So because of that information asymmetry problem, or because of that gap between recipients and supporters, we can, the supporters are likely to care about whether firms give to a particular cause area rather than how much they give. And the more that's the case, the more likely that the variety approach, like the one on your right, spreading the wealth around, is going to be more beneficial for the firm performance. But as we talked about, that's potentially not as good for the social welfare, right? So what we did was empirically to use a sample of foundation giving by 700 plus Fortune 1000 US firms, and then we look at the variety in corporate philanthropy measured by the number of the Herfindahl index of the giving, as well as the number of cause areas they give, and looking at the correlation of that measure with financial profitability. And what we find is that there is a positive correlation, so variety wins. And we also find the mechanisms are quite consistent with the argument of information asymmetry. So we find the more the positive association becomes larger if it's about non-local giving, where you have more severe information asymmetry problems. We find also the givings that is where there's less scrutiny from the stakeholders, is also where you have more positive association. Then the other mechanism is about the stakeholder diversity. So we find in fact runs more true for multi-business firms, as well as firms that is in multiple geography, serving multiple markets, geographical markets. So supplementary analysis suggests that corporate foundation, the donation is actually a substitute for advertising. So the implication of that is for corporate donation itself, the evidence is less clear that this is substantive, or the firms are incentivized to provide substantive support for the recipients. So this is the first column, and Aseem will take over to talk about the second one.
Okay, so the second criteria, which is a little bit of a mouthful, is whether the effect is unequivocal. So the concern here is, even if the immediate initiative that you're focusing on is creating welfare for the people that you're intending to help, is it basically enabling the firm to do bad things elsewhere, right? That's the sort of simple version of it, right? And that comes out of, partly out of there is a large and growing literature now on greenwashing, right? The idea that firms will highlight the few good things they are doing in some areas, but use that to draw attention away from the bad things they're doing elsewhere. And that's particularly concerning because, logically you would only do that if the cost to you of doing the activity you were doing was less than the cost of fixing the thing that you would otherwise have to fix, right? And so if you are, spending a little bit of money to get away with not spending a whole lot of money by having to fix something, of course, how much money you spend and what the welfare impact is not quite the same thing. But if you're doing a little bit here, you're planting a few trees to hide the fact that your factories are belching out smoke, that's a problem, right? And so that's really the spirit of this. We need to make sure that, you have to be sure that even if the specific activity is actually substantive, so it's actually creating value for the intended recipients, it shouldn't be offset by the fact that it's enabling you to do bad things elsewhere, perhaps even making you do more bad things elsewhere. So to look at that, and I think so the study we did that primarily sort of drove that, highlighted this criteria for us, was based on this idea, quite common in the literature, of CSR as a form of reputation insurance, right? So it's been one of the big kind of claims made for why CSR is good for firm performance, is that it acts as a form of insurance. Basically, good deeds earn chits. So you do something good today, if something negative information about you comes to light tomorrow, people give you the benefit of the doubt. And when we started this project, there was, we were reading this article which talked about how you know, Shell had an oil spill in, I think it was the Sydney Harbor or something, and then the people around the oil spill basically said, no, it's fine, it's Shell, we don't mind, we believe it. It's like, they spilled oil in your backyard, are you kidding me? But apparently I mean, of course they were unhappy about the spill, but they trusted Shell to do the right thing because they were a good company, right? And again, there's, you know, you know, literally dozens of papers that have shown evidence for that effect, that firms that seem to be more socially responsible tend to be targeted less, tend to get less negative reactions when bad things come to light. And then, you know, start thinking about this notion of CSR as insurance, especially coming from sort of my background in economics. The first question I had was, but you know, we study insurance markets, we know the big problem is adverse selection and moral hazard. So, right, how do you keep people who know they're going to have, who know they're going to need to make a claim tomorrow from buying big insurance policies, and how do you get people who now have insurance from being less careful because, hey, I have insurance, what do I care, right? And so what we did was we basically built, I'm not going to get into I'm not going to get into the details of explaining that figure, I'll spare you the math. But basically we built a model, we took the sort of canonical Rothschild and Stiglitz model of insurance markets and reversed it and said, what if instead of people buying insurance from firms, firms were buying insurance from people, right? Or firms were buying insurance from society, saying, hey, we'll do a little bit of philanthropy for you today, but in exchange, if something bad happens, we're going to basically put in a claim and be forgiven, right? The important thing about this is, and then, you know, depending on what assumptions you make about how society is thinking about this and how firms are thinking about this, you can get in that model 4 different equilibria, right? The one I want to draw your attention to is equilibrium 3. So the one I want to draw your attention to is equilibrium 3, which is the adverse selection moral hazard equilibrium, right? What happens there is basically firms that know that they are going to be, they are dirty, so there are 2 kinds of firms here, there's dirty firms and clean firms. Dirty firms know they're going to pollute more, therefore they do more philanthropy ahead of time, knowing that they're going to be polluting more in the past and they're going to need more forgiveness, or they have more to be forgiven for. Dirty firms also cut, after they do philanthropy, they actually cut their maintenance expenditures so that, because hey, now I'm protected, I don't need to worry so much about you know, having an accident or having some negative outcome. And so that's the equilibrium that we're concerned about, because basically what happens there is dirty firms get rewarded for doing philanthropy. They actually get rewarded more than clean firms for doing philanthropy, but they also get away with more bad things, right? Which is obviously not what we want from a social welfare perspective. And then, you know, using the model, we derive 2 sets of empirical predictions. So the first prediction says, what's the relationship between philanthropy, actually at the bottom, relationship between philanthropy and accident penalty. So the more philanthropy you do you suffer a bigger penalty or a smaller penalty when you have an accident? And then the other, and the prediction for the adverse selection equilibrium is a negative prediction. So the more philanthropy you do, the lower the penalty you suffer when an accident happens. But then the more important prediction, which is on top, is what's the relationship between philanthropy and accident probability? The more philanthropy do you become more likely or less likely to have an accident after you do the philanthropy, right? And if we are really looking at moral hazard, you would expect the probability of an accident to go up after you give more to philanthropy. And so we test that in a sample of large oil companies in the United States, where again, we use the fact that we have detailed information about their donations, but also we use the fact that we have detailed information about every single oil spill that happens. And the simple sort of find, so one, we do find insurance effects, right? So if the more you've given to philanthropy last year, the less negatively the stock market reacts to your oil spills. But more importantly, we find quite simply that firms that give more spill more. So the more you give in philanthropy this year, the more likely you are to have an oil spill next year, and the larger those oil spills are likely to be. Interestingly, that only affects oil spills that are associated with human error. So it's not the stuff that happens because of, you know, natural causes, there's a storm, there's an earthquake, that doesn't obviously change, which is what you would think, but there's no reason why that should change. What should change in our theory is, right, is the things that are caused by human error because you're doing less maintenance because you're being less careful, and that's exactly what we see in this pattern, right? So again, yes, you are doing good things. I mean, even if we assume for a moment that all the philanthropy you're doing is meaningful and is helping, I think the point estimates on these regressions basically say that for every $100,000 additional you give in philanthropy, the damage you do from the increase in oil spills causes damage of about $200,000 to $1.5 million of damage, depending on how you value it, right? So we're basically saying, okay, the $100,000 may be doing something good, but there's a negative consequence of that that these firms are getting away with. And so that's kind of the unequivocal. And so obviously we don't want that kind of CSR to be the kind of CSR that we want to promote. Next we can talk about inclusiveness.
Yes. Inclusiveness, which is the question of, well, who's being served by CSR activities and what happens to those who's not being served. We're gonna, think about this conjecture that came from a 2003 paper, Kaul and Jiao, especially asking the question of, what happens, and also what happens to the public political process, right? So what are some of the unintended consequences for CSR? So the argument we're gonna, we're making this working paper are threefold. One is, first of all, you've got two different kind of resources or pockets of resources. One is from the government transfer, and the other is coming from, corporate donation, right? Whether you are the man on the top who's economically well off, or you are the one in the bottom who's disadvantaged, you receive a government transfer in some form. And now corporate donation comes in, and there's reasons to believe that because corporate donation is provided in the hope that stakeholders will compensate the firms. So the stakeholders are economically influential people. So this proportion of the resources from corporate donation will go to the stakeholders that's economically well off, and less will go to the ones that's on the bottom. Now that's step number one. Step number two, there's also reason to believe that corporate donation may crowd out government provision. And there's multiple reasons, depends on which literature tradition you come from. From economics, it could very well be that corporate donation reduces tax income. And reduced tax income means less government programs. It could also be from political science side of things. Corporate donation, for any government program, you need a wide constituency of support. And if corporate donation is already targeted towards a set of constituency who's actually also economically influential, then it undermines the overall support for government transfer. If you're more coming from the nonprofit or sociology side of things, there's evidence or argument has been made about the legitimacy for government programs seems to be coming down since the 1980s. And why is that? Because we say, especially the economically influential actors say, well, we are well provided, the private provision works, they're efficient, so why do we need the government at all, right? So, and more importantly, the same jurisdiction, the government provision is decided based not only that targeted way, but also kind of depends on the entire jurisdiction. So the second argument we're going to make is that corporate donation will crowd out government provision not only for those who receive corporate donation, but also for the people in the same jurisdiction that do not receive government transfer, do not receive corporate donation. Now, adding those up, it means that the ones the gap between the man on the top and the man in the bottom is going to be larger, and or maybe the kind of the absolute difference is also increasing, and that's going to lead to social political conflict, right? So those are the three arguments we make in the paper, and this is very very early empirical work. Essentially, what we did is to use the foundation donation data, match it geographically with a nonprofit recipient nonprofit's location. And three results. One, we find that corporate philanthropy is concentrated in urban counties with high income and low unemployment. And even more interestingly, we find that corporate philanthropy is unresponsive to changing economic conditions. So that's number one. Number two, we find increase in corporate donation is associated with a decrease of government transfer, not only in the same county, but also for counties that's in the same jurisdiction, but do not receive corporate donation. Number three, and this is fairly early, where we find the difference in corporate giving for any given county in the United States are associated with a subsequent difference in voting in the presidential election. Now that result, even though it is early, it does hold with county dyadic effect. It does hold with if we only restrict the comparison set within the same state. There seems to be something there, even though it's a fairly small effect size, but it seems to be also comparable with some of the effect size of some of the socioeconomic indicators that you can think about, like income, unemployment. So, going back to the criteria, inclusiveness, and that's quite important, right? It's not only about who corporate CSR is serving, it's also about what happens to those who are not being served, and what happens to the bigger kind of political process. Okay, so back to Aseem.
Okay, so last but not least, if you weren't already sufficiently depressed about the state of corp CSR, we have one last nail to sort of drive into its coffin. Even though we're doing this last, as I said, this is actually where we started. So the idea here is to think about comparative governance. So as Bob mentioned right at the beginning, like my work, and especially not just my work, I think people in strategy have long been sort of thinking about this kind of comparative question: when do we make things? When do we buy things? So it's a long, long tradition of work. And so what inspired us to get started on actually started this entire stream of work, frankly, was this quote from Ronald Coase in 1960 in his sort of seminal Problem of Social Cost paper. And he basically says that, look, economists who study problems of firms ask all the time, how do we decide whether this transaction is best done within the firm or left to the market, right? If we know how to do that, why wouldn't we apply that same kind of thinking to solving social issues and say, okay, if this is the kind of social issue we need to solve, this is the activity we need to undertake, what's the best social arrangement to do that? Or what's the comparatively efficient social arrangement to do that? And so what we've been trying to do is really sort of use that approach. So to do that, and again, these are two papers, so I'm not going to do them full justice in the time I have, but the basic idea is, let's think about what are the transaction costs or frictions involved in solving a social problem. So what are some of the challenges that we have to overcome? Why is it that markets don't work? Why is it that markets fail? Let's map those frictions to the effectiveness of different organizational forms. So in this paper, we think about 4 different organizational forms. The government or state bureaucracies, for-profit firms, non-profit organizations, and cooperatives or collectives. So 4 different pure forms. What are they good at doing? What are they bad at doing? And then if we match the nature of the activity or the nature of the problem to the nature of the form that's best for doing that, we can create a typology of, depending on what kind of problem you're trying to deal with, what would be the comparatively efficient form. I should say right now, this is the one part that, because as you might imagine, it's not that easy to test this empirically. What I'm going to show you is going to be mostly conceptual, but we do actually have a project that we're currently undertaking looking at broadband access in the United States, which starts to test this, specifically thinking about cooperatives versus for-profits, but we haven't quite got the results of that yet. So here is the sort of simple version of the story, right? We basically come back and say that there are 2 things that really that primarily drive social issues. One, which I'm quite familiar with, is externalities, right? So the idea that we do something, but it affects, the effects of that are non-excludable, and so they affect people outside us. We make a distinction, however, between what we call bounded externalities and general externalities. So general externalities are things like air pollution, which affect pretty much everyone, right? So global warming is global warming. It doesn't affect just you, it affects everybody around. Versus bounded externalities, which are things that are externalities, but they're externalities that affect specific narrow communities, right? So everybody in the community is affected, but most people, and nobody outside that community is. And this really goes back to work by Ostrom, etc., where you think about the 1990s sort of design principles for managing common pool resources. The first step there is there has to be some bound where we can define a community who that common pool resource is affected by. That's basically this idea, right? And consistent with Ostrom, the idea here is that where collectives really shine is in dealing with these bounded externalities, right? If you've got an externality that affects a small group of people, but it affects all of them, you're better off getting them to sort of self-organize and manage this collectively, rather than either placing it in the hands of the for-profit who's going to basically not consider the externality, or placing it under government jurisdiction where the state is going to be, have much wider jurisdiction than the collective, and so you're going to get a lot of decisions being made by people who aren't really that concerned and don't understand what's going on. The other thing we emphasize is this notion of ex-post information asymmetry, and Jiao already talked about this information asymmetry problem that we're particularly interested in. The idea that often the people whose problems you're trying to, the people who are the recipients of help are not the people who are paying for the help, right? So I'm paying for things that are actually benefiting other people. I'm paying to save penguins, but I don't know any penguins personally. I don't hang out with them at like cocktail parties and say, oh, how's the ice today? And so because I don't like socially know all that many penguins, or even people who study penguins, I don't really know what's in the penguins' best interest. I don't really know if the money I'm spending is actually going to help penguins, how many penguins it's helping, etc. And that's not only true for those kinds of problems, right? It's also true for things like healthcare, where, all the way back to Arrow, we know that, unless you're a doctor, unless you're a specialist in that particular area, you don't really know whether the advice you're getting is really is in your best interest. There's actually a fascinating recent study which shows that there's which finds a positive correlation between patient satisfaction and 6-month mortality. So the happier you are leaving the hospital, the more likely you are to be dead in 6 months. And the logic for that is basically, if the hospital treats you as a customer and does what you think is the best for you, as opposed to doing what your doctor thinks is best for you, guess what? That actually backfires, right? So those kinds of merit goods are another example of ex-post information asymmetry, where we need expertise. So the overall point is we need somebody to look out for the interests of people who can't look out for their own interests, act, not just necessarily just people, but recipients who can't look out for their own interests. And our argument is that's where non-profits really shine, because the non-distribution constraint means I'm not sort of motivated to try to make money, so I'm actually well positioned to play that fiduciary role, much more so than for-profits. For-profits do a terrible job at sort of looking out for people who can't look out for themselves. So then you might say, well, why don't we just get rid of for-profits from this equation? And what we highlight is really, and this also goes back to kind of our traditional theory of the firm, we highlight that there are really two reasons why having for-profits involved may still be a good idea, right? One is, there might be resources that the for-profit already has that are also useful to solving social problems, right? So I have some expertise, for example, in drug development, right? If you're trying to come up with new drugs to solve neglected diseases, it doesn't really make sense for some non-profit or the state to start trying to get into drug development. We should let the pharma companies do that because they have the expertise, they have the resources. If we're trying to distribute, goods or food to areas after a disaster, it's much better to use the existing infrastructure of a large corporation that already serves those markets than for a non-profit to try setting stuff up themselves. It's also true for things where the actions of the for-profit itself are generating some negative consequences or potentially could help to avoid some negative consequences, right? So for example, if you're trying to stop human trafficking in either airlines or in hotels, well, you already have a set of people who are monitoring what goes on in hotels, who are monitoring what goes on in airlines, right? Putting a separate set of monitors on, getting anybody else to kind of monitor that is going to be much more expensive than just adding one more criteria saying, hey, you're paying attention to what people are doing in their hotel rooms. Can you just make sure that we're also dealing with human trafficking, right? So that's one sort of source, what we call co-specialized assets. So notice, by the way, that this really doesn't sort of make much room for philanthropy. It basically says we need something that's actually integrated, where we're using our expertise, we're using our internal resources, that are the things that give us a business advantage to also solve social problems. The other thing we highlight is really the potential for innovation and discovery, right? So many social problems require us to come up with new innovative solutions. And what for-profit firms do really well is innovate, right? There's again, going back to sort of the theory of the firm literature, we know that the high-powered incentives and for-profits are really good for innovation. We know that for-profits are good at coming up with new technologies and developing new solutions. So if you're looking for something, you're trying to figure out what the best solution is, there's a role for for-profits to play there. And so those are the kinds of problems where we think for-profits can play the biggest role. And so when you map all of that together, and again, I know that's a huge table and I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of that. But what it allows us to do is basically say, look, we can take, given the different types of problems, we can map either pure forms, but also hybrid forms. So combinations of private-public partnerships, combinations of for-profits working with non-profits. And the main takeaway from the table is really, I would say, is twofold. One, of the, I don't know, how many, 6 rows there, only the bottom 2 rows actually involve any kind of government involvement, right? So we are making a case here for a substantial amount of sort of private action to solve public interest. The paper is called Private Action in Public Interest, so it's not that surprising. But we are saying there's kind of private solutions to many social problems, and not everything requires the government to get involved. But at the same time, that's not to deny the role of the state. It's just to say the role of the state. Those last two rows are important, and we need the state to intervene the minute there's kind of general externalities, right? The other thing to highlight about that is, from a corporate social responsibility perspective, there is really, once you get below that first row where there are no social issues, there is really no room for corporations doing things on their own. So we think corporations have an important role to play in solving social issues, but almost always in partnership with other actors, right? So it's really kind of a partnership-driven approach to thinking about solving social issues by corporations. Not going it on your own, not claiming to go it on your own and solve stuff, but really looking for either non-profits to work with, or working with the government, working with collectives, working with other kinds of organizations that allow you to actually make a meaningful difference. So firms have a role to play, but their role isn't just to go it on their own. I'm just going to quickly wrap up by highlighting. So I'm not going to go into this. In the paper, we sort of therefore, everything that we've said so far says here are all the reasons why firms should stay out of it almost. But we kind of use the learnings of these papers to map out a set of best practices. So here is what we suggest firms should be doing. And at the risk of being accused of being nepotistic, the example that actually came to mind, because we've been doing some work, we are in the Carlson School after all, is actually the Carlson Company anti-human trafficking campaign is actually a really great example, right? So, there's a lot of evidence that it truly is substantive. It's very focused. It's the big thing they've been focused on. They're not sort of all over the place. It's hard to think of a sort of offsetting negative effect of this stuff, and it's clearly they're kind of helping. And going back to my last point about comparative efficiency, this is really using your internal resources, your internal expertise to solve an important social problem, right? This is inherently linked to their business model. It's not something that's kind of happening on the side where, okay, we'll stand for something. So I'm just to summarize, I think the idea here is partly from an academic research perspective. I think it's to say, look, we've spent a lot of time in business schools thinking about thinking about CSR and financial performance, it's time that we started to pay more attention to the social impact of these activities. And in doing so, and I think forums like this are great examples of that, in doing so trying to reach across the aisle and sort of start talking to other disciplines, political science, public administration, economics, law, that have been thinking, I mean, of course, we're not remotely claiming to be the first people to think about social issues. Obviously, there's a lot of work there, but bringing some of the insights from that, I mean, I think a lot of the CSI work we've seen so far lives in its own little bubble of like business and doesn't necessarily connect to a rich tradition of sort of welfare development, etc. I think it's also to say, look, if we're going to go around making these claims that firms can do well by doing good, we owe it to ourselves as well as to the people that we're spreading that message to actually ask the question, are we really doing good, right? And we haven't assessed that. We have no business as social scientists going around, walking around saying, oh, we're doing good. I think the second point there is really to say, at least in my experience, most firms that actually, and we've talked to a number of firms over the years about their CSR initiatives, most firms are quite genuine. I mean, again, I don't want to paint firms as, some of this paints firms as villains, but I don't think that's the truth. I think most firms are actually genuinely interested in making a positive social difference, especially the people who run these kinds of initiatives are quite sincere. But often people will ask us, well, we're trying to start something new, what would you suggest, how should we go about it? And our answer tends to be, well, if you want to make more money from that, we can tell you how to do that, but as a business school, we really can't tell you how to do a better job of actually making a social difference. And again, given that these are managers of public for-profit corporations who are our prime constituents, we feel like we should have a better answer for them. And then finally, I think part of the idea here is to think beyond for-profit firms. So I mean, historically, especially, Jiao comes from a more art theory tradition. There is a long tradition in management of thinking beyond the management of just for-profit firms, right? We've long thought about other types of organizations, but over time, partly because the MBA programs are the ones that pay the bills. We spend a lot of time thinking about for-profit firms as though for-profit firms are the only things that exist in the world. But obviously there's a massive. So much of the economy is non-profit. So much of the economy is collectives. There's so much of the actual economic activity is government agencies, and that's something that we feel it would be useful for us to be starting to build connections to and starting to think about more carefully. And so that's pretty much all we've got. I'm happy to take comments.
Terrific. Some of you know who have been here before. I'm not entirely consistent about whether I introduce the speakers first or whether I go around the room to have people identify themselves. I think if we could take just a couple of minutes and just say who you are and what your interest is here. If you're a community member, fine. If you're a student, fine. That way our guests will know a little more about you, and then we'll take some questions. So.
I'm Heidi Jedlicka-Halverson. I'm a student at the Humphrey School, and I work for the Medtronic Foundation. So I'm going to be metabolizing this information for some time.
To be here. Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nick Alm. I'm the Executive Director of Mosier, and we work on LGBT workplace equality here in Minnesota.
Okay, great. Please.
I'm Sophia Terzic, and I'm from U.S. Banks Foundation.
I'm Lou Auermeister, and I'm from U.S. Banks like CSR.
This whole row is the U.S. Bank CSR.
That's right. We want to know your name anyway.
I'm Liz DeZiel, and I'm also a Humphrey Policy Fellow.
Okay.
Kenna Poplar.
I'm Kelly Acker.
Raven Ziegler. I'm a second-year Master's of Human Rights student at Humphrey, focusing on corporate accountability.
Great.
Ann Harris. I'm in finance at Target with no voice. With an interesting responsibility.
Mary Browning. I'm a Humphrey alum. I'm very interested in a lot of things in corporate responsibility service side of things.
Great. Well, glad to have you back. Please.
I'm Janine. I'm a second-year Humphrey School student, focusing on developing practice.
I'm Karen. I'm a Master of Human Rights student at Humphrey.
I'm Liz London from the Medtronic Foundation.
Hi, I'm Chris Kosick. I'm consulting with nonprofits and with small businesses on their corporate responsibility.
I'm Aseem Kaul. I'm the development director at Haiti Outreach. We're an NGO that does sustainable development work in Haiti. We focus on engaging communities and partnering with the local government to help communities have sustainable access to clean water. Personally, I'm very interested in economic development in developing countries, so I come here with kind of two ideas in mind.
I'm Jim Roth. I'm a retired lawyer. I'm currently attending courses at the university as a senior student. I was one of the co-founders of the Advocates for Human Rights and the Center for Victims of Torture. And by the way, the Advocates for Human Rights did work with me, Carlson on the project you just talked about.
Yeah.
And I think there should be more of those.
Yeah. My wife and I have been very involved in the center.
That's great.
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 Afternoon, Taylor Crouch-Dotson, former Humphrey student, currently work for the city of Minneapolis. I work in the city of Minneapolis in the Office of Performance Innovation. We do a lot of public-private partnerships, and so I'm interested to kind of learn more about this at a local level.
I'm Carmen Sims, and I am a former Humphrey student, MBA. And I did my study abroad in Scandinavia in corporate social responsibility. I also work at the Carlson School of Management. And I'm very interested to learn more about the corporate social responsibility and social.
I'm Gonja. I'm doing my master's degree with the Human Rights Department here at the Humphrey School. I focus on business and human rights and economic and social rights. And former non-profit employee, so I feel.
You got a lot of angles on this, right?
Hi, I'm Jen Shadowitz. I'm a former Humphrey alum, or current Humphrey alum as well. And I'm a partner at Zeus Jones, which is a marketing consultancy here. And so we work with a lot of clients, and we've been doing more work with like General Mills, Facebook, companies like that, trying to help them figure out not their CSR, but like how they move social impact to the core of what they do. And so I'm super interested in both sides of this.
Yeah. I'm Kim. I'm an undergrad studying economics, and I'm an intern in the Humphrey School Event Center. So
she's the perfect person to have here, though. A lot of economics today, right? Well, this is about as much expertise and interest as we could possibly get. So I am expecting some terrific questions. Can we have some? Or were they all answered?
It sounds like most of your research was based on what was found in 990s, which is primarily corporate foundations, but it wouldn't include things like product donations or volunteer hours or any of these public-private partnership type activities. How could you factor that into your work to make it a more complete picture, do you think?
Well, I mean, I guess we got to start somewhere, right?
Sure.
In terms of behavioral measures, 990 is where we can find the most complete picture of. Oh yeah, sorry. I think the first response would be, part of it is research design, right? So for us to find a large sample of quantitative data, 990 seems to be the right place to go. And you're right in that it does not include in-kind, does not include employee hours. I think those would be terrific to think about. Now, but I think the framework itself doesn't necessarily only speaks to 990, right? Only speak to corporate donation. In fact, I think it would be really, really interesting to contrast between different types of CSR activities. And the goal is mostly just to say, okay, here are the type of things that may potentially benefit, generate more benefit.
But you've got a great dissertation topic.
And let me also say, I think in all of these, I think we should make the distinction between the empirical work and the theoretical work, right? So I think what's interesting about, let's say, volunteering is, right, there's kind of a sense in which it's partly potentially solving the information asymmetry problem. Because if you are actually working with the nonprofit or you're actually meeting the people that you're supposedly helping, then you are actually observing the outcomes, right? Which is very different from my company. I bought something from a company that gave shoes to children in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like, that's a very kind of, right? So you're working much more closely. In fact, even though it's still in the even within the 990 giving, right, some of the differences we observe in what happens with local giving versus non-local giving are quite stark. Right, so local giving tends to be a lot less kind of symbolic, if you want to, right? So it tends to be much more focused. You don't get rewarded for variety because people are actually observing what's happening on the ground. But when you're giving to, you know, someplace far away, it's much harder to observe things. So I think conceptually, I think there is a difference, and I think that difference actually, the theory speaks to that. I think we would love to get kind of large sample data on employee volunteering. We just don't have it. So the empirics kind of work with what we've got, but you know, we would love to look at that stuff.
And there's some work that looks into the more detailed, but oftentimes that's just focused on one firm, right? Where you have, you know,
and that's the trade-off, right? So you can do one firm or two firms, but it's hard to do like a big. Sorry, yeah.
Okay, so I have a question. Is it like possible to conduct research that's like proactive and almost forecast the expected changes in social issues, like based on like current economic trends? Or like to what extent can you measure that and anticipate changes?
Well, so I think there is, this is nothing that we are currently working on, but you know, I think especially when you think about the work of our newest Nobel Prize winners, right, the Banerjee Dufflo pieces, I think there is increasing interest in looking at field experiments, right, so randomized control trials in the field of things that, so certainly in the development sector we're already seeing that happen. There's a couple of researchers in France at HSA Paris who are actually starting to look at that in the context of CSR, where we're looking at basically rolling out a corporate initiative where we do a randomized control trial where we try one intervention with one group and try a different intervention with the other group and see what the, right? So to the extent that randomized control trials are sort of the gold standard of looking at the actual effect, I think part of the point here is to push towards that kind of thinking. But to get us to push towards that kind of thinking, we need to start by recognizing that our current measurement is not sufficient, and that's really sort of where we are right now. But I think it's I think that is the future of where we need to go.
Yeah, and I think that also kind of pushes into social impact. Right. The reason we're doing this like criteria is because it's really hard to measure social impact, and you guys know that, right? So what this means is randomized control trials, RCTs, or focus on specific issues, specific contexts, and getting fine-grained understanding of what works in this context and how. So that's, I think, what we're hoping to kind of advocate towards. Yeah.
Yes.
I admit to having a cynical attitude towards CSR, and basically you confirmed the rationale of my attitude. But I attended a forum at the Salzburg World Seminar in 2013, and it was on beyond ROI. And at that point, like one guy emceed the whole one full day. He was from Nestle. And they were more emphasizing sort of that concept of shared value. Yeah. And I mean, the example he gave is when Nestle now is making it, and I don't know how much Nestle is really doing this or not. They have a reputation for a lot of corporate wrongs. But if they were going to go into, say, a village in an African country, that they would do an assessment of and determine that they wouldn't go in, sort of take what they could and leave. They would try to determine a way to leave the village more sustainable than when they came in. So they would help them with farming methods, et cetera, et cetera. I suspect, my cynical brain is suspecting that that kind of went by the wayside because corporations don't really want to do that. But that, to me, would be way more positive and beneficial if going into an endeavor of any kind, manufacturing, whatever, mining, that they would do that kind of an assessment, as opposed to doing these sort of deflecting activities of trying to correct harms that are sort of disassociated from how they got to be harmful in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, I think that actually is I think what you just said is in complete agreement with what we are discussing here, right? So, and I actually do think Nestle has done some real work in that space. I haven't studied them all that closely, but my sense is that they are doing real things there. But I think more generally there is a long kind of set of papers thinking about kind of these, I guess now it's called base of pyramid strategies, where you sort of go into these markets and open them up, but you're also actually building the market as you're doing that. So let me say two things about that, right? So one, I think that is entirely consistent with the sort of co-specialized asset idea, right? Of saying, look, this is something that's integrated into our business. It's really kind of something that's integral to what we do as a business, and it builds on our strengths, right? So we are good at developing farmers, we're good at developing sort of, agricultural supply chains. Let's actually play on that strength. The second thing I would say though is I think our argument would be, even if you're doing that, you probably want to do that in collaboration with either local government or some local nonprofits. You don't want to try to figure out on your own what the right answer for a village in Africa is, because the chances are you don't understand it. The chances are there's going to be a bunch of unintended consequences that come out of that. So for example, there's a fascinating case study of Nike right after of course this was a little bit less positive, but right after they got blamed for the sweatshops, they realized they had this child labor problem. And so they decided to move all of their so they used to just, it was piecework outsourced to families, and that's where the children were being put to work. So they decided to all move it into these central factories and said, well, now we've solved the child labor problem. Unfortunately, they didn't actually talk to anybody in the local community when they did that. And so what ended up happening was you did solve the child labor problem, but you also made it much harder for women who had to now commute for an hour to get to your factory when they used to be able to work from home to participate. So a whole bunch of women dropped out, and then public transportation wasn't safe, so women got assaulted, women got attacked, there was a whole sort of, right? So again, you have to sort of think about how do we work with the local community, and you can't do that unless you're partnering with local. And so there's a lot of examples of firms trying to do good things with local communities, but getting it wrong because they don't understand the local community. Yeah, please.
Quick question. In terms of the debates around shareholder primacy and kind of stakeholder theories, I'm not a supporter of Friedman, just to throw that out there, but my question was sort of around if your argument is leaning more towards incorporation of like integrating this framework of social impact into the business model, how does that fit into the debate with shareholders that you would have to, outside of like value congruence, that this would have to be something that they would also be interested in? Or are we like taking it out of those two spaces?
So I was smiling because I'm actually doing that debate. So the Carlson Net Impact and student group is organizing a debate tomorrow at 12 to talk about that, and I'm one of the people debating there. So
at 4. At 4.
I'm for it, although I'm not actually for it. Anyway.
So are you tied up at noon tomorrow?
No, I'm coming.
So you should come. There's free food as well, if that, take care of all stakeholders. Anyway. I think the way we think about that is to say, look, so number one, in all of these models, right, in all the theoretical work, the starting point is this has to be either profit neutral or profit positive for the firm. So our assumption is the firm will not do anything that is not going to increase or at least maintain its profitability, right? So there is absolutely nothing that we are talking about here that is not in the interest of shareholders. So shareholder, I don't think we are supporting shareholder primacy, but I think we're saying absolutely shareholders need their fair share of returns, and nothing is taking away from that. But I think the subtler point, and this is kind of where, I mean, in some sense we agree with Friedman, is I think the point of shared value is that you have to be able to generate enough value to make everybody happy, right? So the reason to not focus only on shareholders and to think about everyone in our mind, even though we sort of ironically agree with Friedman, is, you know, if you can come up with things which allow you to create more value that can then be shared among shareholders and stakeholders, that's actually good. But anything that sort of starts to say, well, we can do this good stuff, but we're going to actually have to make less profit, is suspect not only because it's not good for shareholders, but because it's fundamentally inefficient. And if you're solving a problem in a way that's fundamentally inefficient, that's not good for, it's arguably not good for the stakeholders either. So the idea that there's a distinction there, I mean, again, all of this is very consistent also with Michael Porter's work on shared value. I think for us, the focus is more on saying it's easy to talk about in the abstract, to talk about shared value. How do we actually measure that empirically? And how do what does it actually look like is a much, much harder problem, right? And I think because we haven't focused on that problem, we have a lot of work that talks about shared value very loosely without actually getting into it. I'm not actually keeping track of time. I know there was
no, we're fine. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious what you think of other tools that are out there trying to measure this. So like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index or the FTSE for Good, or there's the long-term stock exchange, which is trying to get off the ground. I know that Fortune magazine used to track businesses that give the most or something like that, and now they're doing this like Change the World Index, which is starting to factor into their methodology, shared or collective impact or something like that. Like, is anyone doing a good job?
You know, the answer to that question, I think, I don't know if we're able to provide, but what we see in the literature is if you compare those ratings, they're not converging very well, right? So everybody is measuring something different.
Right.
Then, you know, a lot of discussion we have with the businesses who's interested in adopting some kind of ESG is, well, which one should we go for? I don't know if you encounter that in your work as well. So that just, to me, and I haven't heard the Fortune, what's it called?
I think it's Change the World.
Change the World. That's interesting. So you're gonna say no? Okay.
Anything that's called Change the World Index is wrong.
But I think that, you know, again goes back to, you know, on the one hand, and I'm with Aseem in that I think a lot of the managers, right, or firms who's trying to do this, but I haven't, at least myself, has seen kind of convincing ways for them to think about social impact. Both because it's hard, as well as, you know, maybe, hopefully we're just early in the conversation.
I think the other thing I would say about that is, you know, and this goes, again, I'm going to put on my economist hat for a moment. I mean, going back to sort of Hansom and Milgram, right, the problem with measuring anything is you always create perverse incentives for people to try to game the index, right? And so I think I think there are some indices that do a better job than others. Don't ask me to say which ones, but, you know, and I do think indices are becoming more sophisticated, and I do think that they're getting better. I'm not disputing that. But I think fundamentally, I think what we should be telling managers is more, look, you need to figure out in your business model what the right solution is, and not just try to play to the index. Because doing things that is going to play to the index is very unlikely to be the thing that actually gets you the most bang for the resources you're putting in, precisely because the indexes by definition has to be broad and has to take into account a whole bunch of things, right? So then that's how you end up with the sort of variety versus the specialization. And that, I think, is the problem.
I think that has to be our last insight for today. Thank you all very much for coming, and thanks again to our guests.
And yeah, thank you all for coming. And you know, as you've seen, we're quite excited and passionate about the topic. So if you have other thoughts for us, feel free to email us. We're happy to sort of chat about stuff online. So always happy to hear from you.